Right. Watch the gap be about 15 seconds. No, I'm just watching to see if it comes through on City Business School. Okay, wait, we seem to be doing something there. Okay, now why we've got us, you've got something in the middle there. We've got Okay. Right. But we'll have Dion on screen, and then what? You got on topics. Dion, could you talk a little bit?
Good morning, Matthew Lester. It's a beautiful day out here in the Eastern Cape. Watching the clock tower, beautiful bougainvilleas, lovely green lawns, and ready for the weekend.
Yeah. All coming through. Okay, Zika. Could we start it at 10 o'clock with Dion saying how's it, and then go to PowerPoint? Can you see it on your screen? Okay. Can I leave you in control of it, or we can sign off now? What do you think?
Matthew, just one silly question. I'd like to advance it. Can I use the arrow keys once we're running? Is that how it works?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, cool.
So we're on the screen.
Yeah, well, we're not. We'll go over the slides after you said hello.
Cool.
That's frozen. It's a bit frozen on YouTube this side. Is there a reason for that? Oh, there we go. Have you got sound? Okay. Right. Fine. Yeah, 5 minutes and then we can start. Yeah.
Can you see yourself?
I can see myself
I'll-
here,
I'll-
but that
I'll-
one is
I'll WhatsApp
delayed.
you.
I can see it, but it's
It's the 1 hour less.
the YouTube one is, but I can see
So
it.
that's all. All right. How many people? Well, people can today, it's not on screen in front of me. The broadcast is coming up on this screen in front of you. So you can use the pictures as it goes along. I should sort of show this. Would you like to say a welcome?
Yeah, maybe we should.
Why don't you say a welcome to the business school quickly while we go to the last couple of minutes? Then you can go so. Okay. Yeah.
Good morning, and my name is Professor Owen Skay. I'm the Director of Rhodes Business School in Grahamstown, South Africa. Very hot day today. It's 30 degrees outside. Great pleasure to be with our partner, City Business School, Moscow. And without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Professor Dion Nell, who will be conducting this one-hour seminar. Dion.
Dobreya otra Moskwa. Let me try that again. Dobreya otra Moskwa. Dobro posho ovet. Preshna shrenya garosho. Good morning, City Business School. Good morning, Moscow. My name is Dionel. It's a pleasure to speak to you all the way in Moscow. And what I want to do today is share the vision of this collaboration between City Business School and Rhodes Business School, and focusing on what we're doing in terms of research here at the business school. We talked a lot about what would be the best way forward to cement this relationship. And our director, Owen, which you just saw, thought that a good way forward would be for us to share some of the research topics that we have just shared with our students in the last day or two. And obviously, we're looking forward to hear what you are doing over there with City Business School. Folks, I'm sure you've Googled us and you've seen where we are in the delightful Eastern Cape of South Africa. We're in a delightful town called Grahamstown. It's an educational city with some wonderful schools and a great university, Rhodes University. Now, as we said, it's a wonderful day today. It's nice and hot. Now, while you're Googling us, you might as well have a look at a lovely coastal village called Kenton-on-Sea and type in there Shelley Beach. And I promise you it is as beautiful as you see there. And we will be going there after this webinar, my colleagues and myself. Folks, we want to try and invite you to come over to the Eastern Cape. And as I look here south, northwest, we're basically surrounded by game reserves. And 15 minutes from here, basically, we have elephants, lions, rhinoceros, leopards, and all sorts of wonderful things. And hopefully we'll see the big six, the southern right whales at the coast tonight as well. So there's a bit of an infomercial inviting you to come and spend some time with us. Folks, in the last day or two, we have uploaded some research topics which we share with our students. And I want to talk you through one of the topics which we have shared with the students, hopefully, which we will then complete in the 6 months, following 6 months. Most of our students have completed their coursework, and they're now with the process of basically starting their research and having this task of writing the research proposal. So what we do is we give them a very strong aim, objective in terms of what we want to see from a particular research topic. We then write them a nice paragraph on the research rationale. What is the theoretical grounding of the research? What are possible approaches that we can follow? And then we give them a strong indication in terms of the research design, possible variables, how it's been used in the past, and then we give them a nice reference list as well. And what I want to talk to you about today is one of those topics which I've titled The Growth of Global Brand Value. What does it mean for BRICS brands? Now, folks, I'm sure you've seen the term coined, I think it was earlier in 2001 by Goldman Sachs, standing for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and ourselves, South Africa, seen as large emerging markets, and how can we contribute to the global economy. And basically, how do we start competing by getting some of the BRICS brands into the top global brands? That's basically what we're interested in and where we're going with this seminar. But on the screen, you've got the Kantar Millward Brown Brand Z data set. There are various data sets out there, and they're all excellent. The famous ones, Interbrand, Brand Finance, the Kantar Millward Brown one. But this particular data set was released in the last 2-3 months. I think what is interesting on the screen is how can we develop a research idea looking at these global trends, and how do we thrash out a research proposal and a research topic for ourselves? And what does it involve to really do this properly, and why do we do this? I guess my personal interest in these brands is simply looking at those red triangles as opposed to the 2 green triangles on your screen there. Now, I guess in a normal lecture with 60 students in front of you, MBA students will very quickly indicate to you that the 8 red triangles are basically all technology-based brands. There are only 2 non-tech brands in the Kantar Millward Brown ratings for 2017, namely the payments company Visa and McDonald's, the great fast foods business. I think what is interesting, how did this change over the last 4, 5, 6 years? And the question is, what is most important here for us as BRICS countries? Do we invent our own tech industry because it seems like the tech industry is the winner here? Or do we invest in high-performing brands? Which is best, the industry or the firm or the brand? So that might be a research idea which we can consider by simply just having a look at the sort of cursory inspection of what is before us. Now, I think what is quite interesting, and I'll leave you to think about this, is there's one major brand which has been there for the last 20 years, and it's always the topic of a great marketing discussion in the classroom, that's simply not there. Now, if you jog your memory, who is that, and why have they perhaps slipped off the 2017 rankings for this particular company that's done the ratings? Well, maybe if I show you what the data looked like in 2013, I think you need to make a comparison of the ratio between tech and non-tech brands. Let's have a look if we can get the next slide up. Folks, let's have a look at 2013. In 2013, Apple was top with a global brand value of $185 billion. But you now see more non-tech brands in 2013. So basically what that's telling us that in the last 4 or 5 years, the tech brands consistently have become more dominant, and the non-tech brands seem to be slipping out of the top 10 list. And I guess the one that you would have identified relative to my question is number 5. Where's Coke gone in 2017? Where is Marlboro gone and General Electric? They are not in the 2017 list. They've been replaced by people like Facebook and other emerging, fast-growing tech brands. Let me go back to the previous slide and ask you another question, and that is, there's one brand on that 2017 list that is of interest to us as the BRICS community. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the great Chinese e-commerce company, Tencent. They're basically almost in everything, in payments, social, chat, you name it, they're there. Now, how did they get so quickly into that top 10 list? And is it something that we just saw in 2017, or is it something we should have picked up back in 2011, 2012, 2014, from analyzing the longitudinal data, and based on that, make a prediction that Tencent probably would make it into the top 10 4 or 5 years from now? I think the question is, from the analysis that we're going to go through, that was quite evident from the analysis that Tencent was going places. And the question I think we want to ask you today is, what has happened the last 2, 3, 4 years? And who would be those brands which we're not so sure about and might be in the top 10 rankings 4 or 5 years from now? Because that's basically where you want to put your money. And could it be that a brand value analysis such as this could actually predict future market capitalization? Those are some of the rough research ideas I think that you could come up with simply by looking at broad trends such as this. And this is the kind of research topic that we're sharing with our students, hoping that we'll find something interesting from this. Okay, I'll quickly go back to the next slide. We'll just run through this little animation, and then we'll get back to the next bit of Millward Brown data, which basically compares the rankings from 2006 to 2017. Now, what I would like you to look at is quickly find who's survived the last 10, 12 years, who's in the 2017 rankings that were there in 2006. Now, if you cast your eyes on that list, the 2006 and 2017, you'll see that there are only 3 brands that survived into 2017. And that is an interesting point, the issue of brand persistence or consistent performance over time. And you'll see that would be Microsoft, Google, and IBM. We're not surprised, 3 major tech brands, but look who has crept in. Strong performance of Apple since 2007 because of the iPhone launch. Amazon in there, Facebook in there, AT&T, the great American telephone and telegraph company, and obviously then Tencent. Folks, only 2 non-tech brands. Again, you might want to look at that and say, what is this telling us? Is this driven by an industry effect, or is it simply because of great brands being built by Google, Apple, Microsoft, and all the other tech players? Now, some people would say Amazon is not really a tech brand, it's a retail brand. That is probably true. But if we look what Amazon has been doing the last couple of years, robots picking stock in massive warehouses, getting the books on planes, and getting it delivered within 2 days anywhere in the world almost. The amazing acquisition of Whole Foods markets in the US. Why would a retailer which is technologically driven by a food retailer? I guess most food retailers would break out in a sweat if they think about the capabilities from a technology point of view, which Amazon can now do. In other words, collecting your great organic grown vegetables, carrots and whatever, and having that delivered by drone to your back porch is an amazing achievement. And if we look what sits behind that, the skill of managing satellites, GPS coordinates, electronic engineering, bringing that all together seems to me like more of a tech company than a retail company. And therefore, if we look at the trajectory of the growth, it's certainly displaying the kind of growth which we've seen Apple since 2007. So it'll be interesting to see at what point Amazon might be reclassified as a tech company. Also, if we look at the dates for which we've got the brand value growth data, I think the interbrand data goes back to 2000, 2001. The brand finance data might also be a longer time frame. But for this data set, the Millward Brown data set, the data runs from 2006 to 2017. Now, my colleague, Professor Skay and Matthew Lester, they both finance, tax, accounting kind of people. And I'm sure they've dealt with the global financial crisis in great depth, and you would know what that graph looks like. We all know what happened there in 2007 and 2008. Now, I took the data from ycharts.com, and it basically looks like this. The familiar dip there, I think about June 2008. I think the data says a minus 37% total annual return drop on the Standard & Poor's 500 index, which it recovered quite nicely there by 2009, but quite erratic for the last 10 years. A bit of a dip there, 2012-13, again here towards the end of 2014 and 15, and hopefully we're getting out of that with a bit of a recovery in 2016 and 17. At least that's for the rest of the world. We in the BRICS countries, I'm not so sure if we're following that growth as quickly as it should be, but a bit more about that a bit later. I think that the point that we want to make here is it seems like if we look at total annual returns of all brands across the world, they tend to follow the major indices around the world. Now, the clever folks over at Millward Brown has done something like this and says, look at this. If we took the top global brands over the last 12 years, how does the brand growth performance compare to the previous shareholder returns? Now, folks, I think the purple previous graph seems to be a fairly erratic up and down performance with a serious dip there in 2008. But look at this. If we look at the growth of brand value, particularly looking at 2007, there was no dip. If we look at the top brands in the world, performance is a consistent growth trajectory over a 12-year period. And that graph represents about an 8% average total return over the period. I think the Cantor Millward Brown folks say over the last 12 years, that represents about 152% of total growth. But it's an interesting trend. It's an interesting sort of piece in the puzzle, which you want to consider in your quest to build your research topic, building your research dissertation. You know, what does this mean, and could we use and contrast? Let me just put that up back again. The previous graph, one that includes the global financial crisis, the erratic performance, and my goodness, if you can build a global brand, all that volatility just disappears. Okay, well, why don't we just park that one? We keep the great performance of the top 10 tech brands in mind. We look at the growth, and we keep the question of, is it the industry or the firm alive? All trying to say, well, how do we build this into a credible research proposal, which the professor would like? Folks, I think if we put that together, it brings us to combining all these interesting observations into a possible MBA research topic. And this is why we're doing this webinar, because not only are we interested in doing this research locally with our own students, but obviously we're also interested in working with City Business School, with all the MBAs over there in Moscow and Russia. And I think what you want to do is answer this question. What matters most in explaining brand value growth? I think it's quite easy to look at that performance and say, well, obviously, it is the technology industry. We've all seen how wonderfully they've performed and how they've increased their dominance over the last 5, 6 years. It's hard to argue against that data. You might also argue and say, but no, it's not the industry. It's just those wonderful people at Google, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and so forth. It's the wonderful investment in the brand. It's the marketing assets. It is the firm that's driving the performance and not the industry. Now, the issue with this is, as a prospective topic owner and preparing your research proposal, you cannot try and answer that question unless you have a strong theoretical argument that basically answers that question before you start your research. And over the years, we have found MBA students tend to struggle with this kind of answering a clear research question. And students tend to do a summary of the literature. They get 50 papers together, find a few clever sentences, add them together, and try and piece the story together. And believe me, we see these things as external examiners, and they stand out like a Thor sum. And that's not the way to do it. The proper way is to first identify the theory that can possibly explain that theoretically. Now, folks, that's where we get to the formal, formulation of the research question. And if we start looking at a strong theoretical background, something like this pops up. Because you might think that you've got a clever idea, or you stumbled or something really unique. But as we start reading, there's always somebody before us that saw this before you. And what about if we start investigating the research question in terms of a proportion of the industry effects relative to the firm effects? And what if we start using this wonderful data set where we've got global brand values, performance across 6 global regions? Because if we really start looking at that individual brands, there's huge American dominance. But we've also seen the growth of emerging brands entering these global ratings. So how can we explain global brand value by looking as a predictor in terms of, are you an American brand, a UK brand, or a European brand, or a Russian brand? So could we use global region as a predictor, and what would that say? In other words, does the brand value depend on who you are or where you come from? In answering that research question, as I've said, it is now our job to try and identify the most appropriate theory which can answer that question. And unless you know which theories are available, this becomes a tough job. And that's why in the last 2 days, we have uploaded probably about 30 research topics. This is just one, which I'm now explaining in a bit more detail. But it's a bit of a tough job to ask an MBA student to go and read agency theory, transactional cost analysis, social identity theory, social exchange theory, and the other possible 25 theories that can possibly answer that research question. It's probably the job of the supervisor that knows the theories to say, well, here are 2 or 3 appropriate theories that could possibly answer that question. And here at Rhodes Business School, what we've done, we've bumped up our ability to explain our research more theoretically. And one of the theories we're looking at is research-based theory, and trying to sort of channel a lot of the research topics using resource-based, stakeholder, signal, and whatever. Now, why we like research-based theory as a possible explanator or a predictor of long-term growth, brand value growth, is the ability of resource-based theory to really explain long-term performance of firms over time. Now, it hasn't been this clear-cut before 1985. I think before 1985, there's a wonderful, rich literature based on economics coming from the 1930s, which says that, if you want to be in a competitive position, pick the right industry. And I guess the tech people would say, well, we told you, you should have been in the tech industry. Until 1991, where Professor J. Barney wrote this seminal paper in 1991. In those days, it wasn't called resource-based theory, it was called the resource-based view. But he came up with 4 critical assumptions on which he based the theory, but basically arguing, saying that a dominant industry player would not be a long-term solution for long-term competitive advantage. What you need to do is to build firms with rich, deep resources. And he classified those into 4 categories, and that's known today as the VRIO framework. Basically what he's saying that we need to invest in resources that's heterogeneous, it's diverse, it's different in terms of its ability to differentiate the firm. We saw the contribution earlier by Lipman and Roepmelt, which said that, well, basically, you should be competing in such a way that you can't be copied. Some fancy esoteric academic terms there, that's called imperfect imitability. Also the ability to outperform over the long period. I think you can pick up there our interest in understanding why brands consistently outperform the competition over time. And we've got that data, but yeah, we've got a theory that explains that before we actually embark on the empirical side. And obviously, folks, in our ability to combine the value, the rarity, the imitability into one framework is where the real competitive advantage sits. But I think it's important for us to get our heads around that early work by Barney, Connor, Ketchen, Wright, and so forth, and what's been said there. Because once we read that, it basically answers our research question. And it says, well, if we look at resource-based theory, it should be the firm that's the determinator of long-term performance because of the investment in organizational resources. Okay. For us, in putting this topic together, the problem we've had from a marketing point of view is that resource-based theory is not a marketing theory. It is a strategic management theory. So, could we build a bridge between the RBT knowledge in the strategic management literature and link that to marketing? And it was interesting to see that some early scholars, Shrivastava, Shivani, and Fai, already started talking about marketing as market-based assets, generating customer value. They talked about the rarity aspects and the ability to sustain customer value. Great paper there by Steenkamp in 2014 explaining the brand value chain. But I guess what helped us a lot in putting this topic together was building the bridge between a strategic management theory and the early indicators that this theory could be used in marketing. We saw a great paper in the Journal of Academy of Marketing Science in 2014. I think it's a Russian lady, Kozlenko, basically arguing for the application of RBT in marketing. I should have put that reference in there, but I did put that in terms of the more detailed topic. But I think once you're there, you then want to extend this bridge a bit further and say, well, okay, could we apply RBT to brands? So we're almost cascading from the top level, the strategic management, to marketing to brands. And I think you can see what's coming in, going down to brand value and then going down to origin of the brands. Okay, so I'm not going to go through every single thing here, but there's a lot of evidence in the literature that brands are a typical example of an intangible, heterogeneous firm resource, which fits in beautifully with the Barney VROI framework. There was also a great paper by an ex-colleague, Sinclair, which did a lot of work on demonstrating how brands are owned and they cannot be copied. I think he's put a nice paper together with Professor Keller recently, and the issues in terms of how brands are rare, they can't be easily substituted. And again, the Steenkamp paper, which picks up the brand value side, the connection with the next slide. There's a lot of evidence going back to 1991 that brands do add a lot of value. There's a great paper in Marketing Science by Simon and Sullivan, demonstrating profits directly related to brand equity, how we should grow the intangible wealth. And a lot of papers, they're linking brand value to actual shareholder performance and how long-term brand value can actually increase the financial performance of the firm. So folks, I think what we try to do in putting this research topic together is to say, well, we've got an interesting question that's derived from hard data, some consistent trends that we're seeing, but we did not have a theory to explain that away. And digging a bit deeper here, using resource-based data gave us a theoretical grounding for taking this research and putting it together into something which we can perhaps test empirically. Now, I guess one of the issues that we see MBA students sometimes do struggle with is the differentiation between theory and literature. And there's this misconception that by summarizing the literature, that is actually a proxy for theory. Well, it's not. What I want to do now is to say we've dealt with the theory component of answering our research question, but what has been happening in the literature, and are there some competing models we can use in terms of putting our research design into place? And as I've said here, part of the brief which we give the students is we tell them the theoretical rationale, but we also do give them a possible research design. I just want to walk you through 3 or 4 competing models which we are considering, and I'll show you the one we've picked. But here's the classic Rust, Lemon, Zeitamol paper in the Journal of Marketing, which basically argues and says that we need to look at marketing the way the finance folks look at it, and understand that marketing is actually a return on investment. And the inputs there in terms of the model is we need to be efficient in terms of our customer attraction or acquisition. And once we've got them, we better keep them. And once we've got that, we can model that in terms of the customer lifetime value. So there's a need return based on a cost, and this could be a potential model which we can consider in terms of our RBT theory and linking it to our brand value data. Another one which we are considering and using is the Vogel, Ivanchenich, and Rameseshan model in 2008. It's basically a follow-up on the Rust paper in 2004, and basically getting us to think about value, relationships, and brands. I think you can again see the lovely link between those equities and some of the assumptions that we saw in the RBT theory. The next one would be a sort of a financial derived model. Could we link marketing with market capitalization? I think the gold standard one is the one at the bottom there, and this is the Kuma and Shah 2009 paper. Once we have the stock price and the number of outstanding shares, and we multiply that, we have the market capitalization, and basically that is a value of the firm which nobody would argue with. I think from a marketing point of view is marketing chief operating officers sitting on the board needs to justify their seat on the board. And the models we've been looking at previously simply says that. Could we collate thousands of customers into sort of a share portfolio of customers, calculate the value of each of that customer, and call that customer equity? And if we do that properly, that should correlate quite well with the traditional stock market valuation of firms. So it seems like those two parallel processes might explain that good marketing brand value evaluation should actually become a predictor of actual traditional market capitalization models. The one we liked and which we are going to use is the model by Professor Keller and Lehman, a great paper in the Journal of Brand Management in 2009. And what I want you to look at is the two green boxes, focusing on brand persistence and brand growth in terms of explaining the long-term brand value. Now, from the data, we know that the tech brands have been very persistent in terms of performing over time, so we can pick that out of the data set. And another aspect, theoretically, conceptually, as defined by Keller and Lehman, says, well, you got to keep growing over time. You can't afford to dip below 0%, because that will have a negative effect on the long-term brand value. And again, inherently in the data, it is fairly easy to calculate the brand growth from year to year. And in this data set, it becomes really interesting because you can actually model that longitudinally over a 12-year period. What I want you to see here in drafting that research proposal, and as a possible platform for Rhodes Business School and City Business School in Moscow to work together, is to say, well, we now have a theory, we've gone through the literature, we've got some competing models, they could all work, but the one we like, which we think we can implement fairly quickly, is this model number 4. The issue here, folks, is just the rigor, just the process, just the knowledge, and demonstrating that we've been through the theory, been through the literature, before we actually start putting the empirical execution or the research design into place. Okay, so with that sort of nailed down, our research idea is starting to get a life of its own. And it's now time to basically write that difficult part, the methodology. So how are we going to bring this together? What we are looking at is to use any of the leading brand value rating agencies, and then any one of those would be appropriate. I don't think that it matters. At the moment, we're looking at the Millward Brown Z, simply because they're part of WPP, the world's largest advertising agency, a wonderful research capability in terms of Kantar, Millward Brown, and we've got a wonderful longitudinal data set, something which we in marketing do not always have easy access to. So why not use multiple waves of data from 2006 to 2014 to actually test our theory, test our research question. So with that on a plate, what actually happened here, if you looked at the breakdown of the sample, we have data across 23 industries. That would be banking, retailing, cars, water, coffee, tech, whatever. At the moment, we've got 275 brands nested within those industries, 1,926 observations, and 9 waves of data, and across 6 global regions. In that data set, we've got the brand value in US dollars. We've got the persistence, in other words, picking that up from the Keller and Lehman model. Basically how that works, let's say you've been in the global rankings 10 out of 10 times the last 12 years or 10 years, that simply would mean that you would have a persistence rating of 100%. If you've been dropping in and out, let's say 5 out of 10, that would be 50%. There are more sophisticated ways of measuring persistence in terms of time series models, but for the time being, we thought we'll deal with persistence by simply calculating how many times you've been in the rankings. We've got the year from 2006 to 2014, the regional dummies, and obviously we now have an opportunity to start having a look at the effect of interactions at the industry level and the firm level. Now folks, this is where the fun starts. Before we actually think how we're going to analyze the data, we probably need to look at possible techniques that can deal with this additional complexity. Traditionally, we would have 1 or 2 variables at one level or one unit of analysis, and that makes life fairly easy by using something like a multiple regression. But what do we do when we have to run 3 or 4 regressions stacked on top of one another? Because what we now have here at the bottom, we've got measurement occasions. We've got a value for Apple in 2006. We've got a value for Apple in 2007 and for 12 years. But maybe there's some regional bank that were in the rankings in 2006, didn't make it in 2007, 2008, built the brand and dropped back in 2009. So you need to deal with a technique that can deal with those missing values. And that's what we're trying to illustrate on the bottom line there. Those are simply the dollar values per year. But remember now, we have data, according to the data set, nested within particular brands. So B1 could be Apple, and we could have 10 years of data for Apple. B2 could be Google, and we'll have perhaps 9 years of data. And then obviously each one of those brands are then nested at the industry level. So industry 1 will then represent technology, industry 2 banking, and let's say industry N cars, and we'll have that for 23 industries. The question is, how do we formulate hypotheses when they run across levels and where we have different predictors across different levels? And that was a bit of a head scratcher for us, because the minute you start modeling this data with ordinary least squares regression, we run in all sorts of multi-collinearity problems and whatever. Okay, folks, before we say how we're going to do this, what we wanted out of this research is obviously get a benchmark. You know, what is the average trajectory of brand value for the entire sample across the entire time frame, which would probably be the typical fixed effects component of that model. I think if we look at that second paragraph, it simply says, once we have the baseline, how would a particular industry deviate from that baseline, up or down, both for the industry and the brand? And if we could do that and model that in one model, that's a pretty cool thing to do, because you were able to show how far above the tech industry is, for instance, above banking or cars. And if you can actually quantify that specifically, it gives us an indication of the variance, which gives us the typical random effect. But we also want to explain why those differences exist, and therefore we need some predictive variables. So those are possibly 3 objectives which fall out of this research, which fits with the theory, which fits where we want to go, what we want to do empirically, but we still have the problem we need to set some hypotheses and we need to model the data. Okay, I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but the first job we want to do is we want to say, is there a difference between the industry and the firm? Coming back to that critical research question, coming back to our very first slide, we're still not sure. Is it the tech industry or is it the brand that's driving the performance? The only way we can do that is we have to do a trick, or called the variance components model, and we see that wonderful little Greek term there, and what we can say there is, if industry is larger than 0, we can actually determine that industry is more effective than firm, or vice versa. The second hypothesis which worried us was the literature on region or brand origin is not clear. There's a huge base of literature that says where the brand comes from, its origin, is a huge determinator in terms of its success. And the other half of the literature says it doesn't matter. People like Sami, Steenkamp, Shrivastava, and so forth. So the literature simply isn't clear. What happens to the effect of the origin of the brand as the effect of the brand increases over time? So theoretically, if we can say, because of resource-based theory and the increasing effects of the brand, that would be more important than where the brand comes from. We've got the data, and that's a pretty cool thing to say, and it could actually clear up some of the confusion in the literature. And if we could do that, we might have something to say, and that little Greek term there in terms of hypothesis 2A does exactly that. In other words, what is the effect of the random brand slope on brand performance given Origin's declining trend over time? I would say the third one there is simply just persistence. Keller and Lehman says the more persistent the brand, the better the performance. So it's not something that just falls out of the sky. It's something that goes back to the literature and goes back to our theoretical explanation of why brands outperform the industry definition of long-term performance. Okay, so far we're kind of intact. We're covering all the bases. We're joining all the dots. We're looking good. Okay. Bear in mind, this is a research idea. This is a topic saying to an MBA student, what about this? Is this something that would be of interest? Because if we can pull this off, it adds value to your MBA. In other words, it's the research component of the MBA that differentiates the skill. The coursework is the same for everybody. But when you walk into the employer and you put something on the table which only you know how it works, that means dollars in your pocket in terms of a nice salary as a reward for doing all these hard things. So folks, I'm trying to talk to you as an MBA student and trying to sell you the value of creative original research and why that will be a great thing to say when you open yourself open to the interrogation of that interview. Also, the effect of long-term career success. It sits here right in front of us. What we are playing around with is obviously to get this data into a top-end statistical package. You can do this in SPSS, you can do this in R. I prefer Stata, and this is the actual sample data set that we've put into Stata, and you'll see there the industry, apparel, beer, and that will run down the screen for 23 industries. Nested in that would be the individual brands in each industry. We've got the data from 2006 to 2017. I'm only showing you the data from 2006 to 2014. And the reason for that is I want to try and explain how did Tencent, this great Chinese e-commerce brand, get into the top 10 rankings from nowhere? Well, it's not from nowhere. If we've been analyzing this data, we would have seen back in 2012, 2013, something happening which will explain the future performance trajectory. It would have been great if we put some money into that back in 2013, because as some local people has done, it's made them billionaires, simply for knowing what the rest of us did not know. And I want to come back to my other question. What are the other brands lurking out there that's going to be the next Tencent 3-4 years from now? It's very difficult to identify that by just a cursory inspection or trying to look at 300 brands and comparing the performance from 1 to 1 year. That is a bit of an archaic way of doing it. And what we're trying to do here is to build a model which will identify those gems based on a bit of a smarter statistical procedure. Okay, folks, we're not trying to scare anybody here, but unfortunately this stuff does not work with a bit of algebra. You can go and look at this. This is the famous Breich and Raudenbusch notation, but it basically enables us to split the intercepts from the slopes, and what you'll see there, we can specify the various predictors at the various levels. In other words, 1.4, if you look at X1, X2, X3, X4, X5, and X6, or X5 in this case, those would be the regional dummies. So X1 would be the US, X2 would be Europe, X3 UK, and BRICS, all the others in there. And that W over there is simply the persistence, and we then consolidate that into one regression model, and voila, we have overcome our methodology problems by using the fancy sort of multi-level approach. What we get out of this is simply a few regression lines stacked on top of one another. Now, I want to remind you the objectives we've stated. We want to get one average line, and exactly that, stack the various lines on top of one another. Now, if you look at the left-hand side, the random intercepts, that's exactly what's happening. We are stacking the various industries relative to each other and the average. And you can see the top two there, they're way above in terms of log brand value on the x-axis compared to the bunch here, 1/3 up, and obviously the average stacked there around the 8.3 brand value level. So again here, a lovely sort of technique of giving you a visual and statistical check on how the various industries stack up to one another. Now, once we switch on the random slope, in other words, which is the random or the change over time, some interesting things happen. Those slopes start changing. And if you look at the top two there, the one that sort of is declining and the one that's increasing, the question is, who are those industries? And then the green highlighted one sloping up very fast. Who would that industry be? I think, folks, unless you do this kind of analysis, it's a bit of a hit and miss, by just looking at a cursory inspection of the data. Who are the fastest growing industries? We might pick that up for 20 or 22, but how do you do that for 200, 300? And we start looking at the next slide, the brands. But I think we get into the point where we're kind of comparing the performance of the industry relative to one another over time for a longitudinal data set. If we look at the brands, remember this represents 275 brands, and in the middle there, they're all stacked on top of one another. And what we now know, those sort of lines on top there would obviously be the top performing tech brands which we've seen. What we now know is how those brands actually competed. And once we put the rate of change in, you look at the top slope there, the 170, and I guess you want to know who that is. Well, the data is saying Google is #1 in 2017, but Apple is going to win in the long run. Well, we will have to wait and see. We'll have to see what's happening today with the iPhone launch. It's looking good. And if that goes well, we might just see Apple on top next year. But what you can also see, there are lots of little steep slopes hidden in this maze of curves. And if you look here at bottom at number 6, log brand value, there's a few lines starting there very low in 2006, but a rapid rise over time. Folks, that's derived from fancy stats, fancy algebraic models. And what we need to do is now fish those 10, 5, 6 rapidly growing brands, but based on a set of well-defined variables, which might be the stars 3, 4 years from now. In other words, who's going to be the 10 cent that's going to be in the top 10 5 years from now that you should know now to put your money into it right now? I'm going to go through this one, but this is just a fancy way of saying, let's start off with model 1, which is the basic variance components model, which checks for the relative influence of the industry versus the firm. Now, as we move from model 1 to model 5, the top purple bit there, we can start switching on certain switches. And as we switch on a particular switch, we can determine the effect of that variable on the long-term brand value, a la Keller and Lehman. Now, you'll see those variables are the regional predictors, persistence, and so forth. So what happens if we run the model with the predictors and without? What does the brand value look at? And you can't see that, but for the time being, that's not important. What is important is how to model the data. Now, what happens if we run model 3, which gives more emphasis to the industry, but it detunes the brand effect? What happens to long-term brand value? And it gives you all sorts of parameters, both at level 2, level 3, the industry and brand effect. And from that, you can get an insight on how to, well, test your hypotheses. Remember what we're trying to say. As we switch on the effect of the brand over time, we suspect that brand origin will become insignificant. In other words, it doesn't matter. Now, if we look at model 3, what we've done there, we've switched on the industry effect and detuned the brand. Model 4 is the reverse. We detune the industry and we switch on the brand. And as we influence the effect of the brand more and more, what do we see? Well, that the various regional predictors become insignificant, which is model 4. Now, folks, that's pretty powerful stuff. This is saying we can prove the effects of the brand using a longitudinal multi-level model, but it's not just because of some fancy numbers. We knew this because resource-based theory said to us that is what would happen with long-term success because of the VRIO framework, because of the value, because of rarity, because of imperfect imitability, and our ability to organize all these resources. That's why we win, not because of the industry, and we have some hard data to now prove that. Now, folks, normally we would stop here because I think we've proved the research question, but I've just included some sort of insights into what we are trying to get out of this data. And here's one category. What does it look like if you are a high brand value sector? Now, folks, look at the orange line. The orange line is the average. That is that very first objective which we talked about. What is the baseline? I can tell you that almost 9 log brand value is about $14 billion. That's almost the average brand value for the entire sample data set. Now, if you look at the black line, that is the random intercept. That is how far the conglomerate in this case is above the average. Now, the conglomerate in this data set is basically General Electric. They're the only firm in the world that sells jet engines, does finance, basically everything you can think of. So they're huge one dominant brand sectors. The only other example in the world that's achieved that status is entertainment, and that's Disney. Now, what's interesting is if you are performing so far above the average, look what happens to the green dotted line. That's the random slope. In other words, what is happening to change in brand value over time? And the old story is, if you start high, if you fly high, the only way you can go is down. And that's what we're seeing consistently. If you have high brand values in 2006, chances are that you're going to have a declining slope. Now look at the bottom two, cars and global banks. Because they are more competitive, the random slope, the black line, is much closer to the average, and also their green lines slopes much stronger to the bottom. So obviously you don't want to be in category 1, high brand value intercepts with declining slopes. So that's an interesting insight, I think, which came out of the data, which you wouldn't obviously be able to spot unless you can draw the orange line, the green dotted line, and the solid black line. Now, what does it look like for everyday consumption goods? Water, coffee, soft drinks, fast foods. What do we see here? It's the reverse of the category 1. The black line is far below the average. We're looking at 6, 7, for water and coffee. Soft drinks and fast foods looks a bit better. But what's interesting here is if you start low, chances are that the green line, the rising slope, is going to look a lot better. And for fast foods, they've managed to get that brand value up very close to the average. Think about McDonald's in that top 10 listing. This is one game I think you don't want to be in the moment. If we look at climate change, we look at disasters around the world, power stations blowing up, that costs money. Look at this, folks. You're starting off with a low brand value intercept, but you're also going down. And I think the one industry that pops up here that probably in the 2015, 16, and 17 data will become even more pronounced is this particular industry. It's an interesting one. Not so sure if you want to be in there. Although I must say, if you look at the 2027 data, there's a great Chinese insurance brand called Ping An. Ping An is doing wonderfully. They're probably sitting around, I'm not sure, about number 30. But it just shows you again the support for resource-based theory. A great brand using the assumptions of resource-based theory can actually perform in a poor performing industry. Again, supporting the theoretical explanation where we're going. What are the two great places to be? In other words, what does it look like when you have a high brand value intercept? You're above the orange line, but the green line keeps going up. That's the kind of industry I want to put my money in. Now, folks, just look around the world. NTT, Docomo, Airtel in India, MTN in South Africa, Vodacom in the UK, AT&T in the US. They're all doing well, simply because of the price we're paying for data. And the other people doing well are the payments companies, Visa, MasterCard, and so forth. We can see those rising green slopes despite being quite high above the average line. So what I think we're seeing here is a bit of a higher level interpretation of what's going to happen with industries as measured by brand value. And all we want to do now is do the same exercise for brands. And this is where we're coming now, why we're doing this, for this particular talk aimed at ourselves and you in Moscow. Which of the BRICS brands can we fish out on the right-hand side which holds promise? Now remember, we're now sitting in the year 2014, and we've got the luxury of looking at data backwards. What will happen to these brands as we progress to 2017? Well, the big players are there, folks. Look what happened to Apple. And what we're interested in is the green line. Despite that massive differential above the average, the black line, which is their random intercept, look how they have grown over the last 10 years. Compare that to Google top right, IBM and Microsoft. But simply, we can explain the performance of the technology brands, not because of the industry they're in, but because of how well they have invested in the diversity of their resources, a la RBT. So we can explain the data theoretically, and we knew that before we started. And that's the trick, folks, to write the proposal in such a way where the theory will predict the data. It shouldn't be a surprise. Now, what does it mean for us in Russia, South Africa, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa? Based on that analysis where we fished out the great slopes, 4 brands came up. And the one which is really interesting is top right, Tencent. Look at the shape, size of that slope. Now, top right would be 2014, going back 2013, 12, and 2011. Now, when you look, there is no data prior to that. In other words, emerging brands out of the BRICS countries do not have a long track record. They basically don't have great persistence. Yet we've got BRICS brands coming into rankings at levels way above the average. And Tencent, they're looking very good. Now, what does this mean if you're Russia? Which brand popped up there which looks very promising? And that is Sber Bank. I think Brand Finance now have them listed as the 6th most valuable brand in Russia, and obviously the Tencent brand. But the beauty was, folks, if you looked at this data in 2011, 2012, you should not be surprised that Tencent is in the 2017 rankings. In other words, this is data that's now, let's say, 3 years dated, intentionally, trying to demonstrate that we knew what Tencent was going to do 5 years ago. And the beauty about this kind of analysis is, again, what will be the brands in the BRICS countries that will be in the top 10 rankings 4 or 5 years from now? Because that's where we want to put our research and our marketing effort. Okay, it's not always that good. What does the B stand for in BRICS? Well, we know that's Brazil. I've elected not to put the brand in there, which are in such deep trouble. And remember, this is again data starting out in 2011, 2012, with a serious declining trajectory. And if you go and Google what's been happening in Brazil, you'll probably pick up that brand and then go and read behind what's happened there. Well, it seems to be a perennial problem in emerging markets, but I'll leave that to you to go and research. But again, I think we could safely predict it, that that brand would have been in trouble, and my goodness, are they in trouble 5 years since this data was analyzed. I'm going to be very quick on this one, and then I want to wrap up. This is a very busy graph that tries to put all of this stuff together. And it basically is modeled on our framework by Keller and Lehman, which basically says you got to model brand value growth on two variables, persistence and growth. So what you need to look at is top and bottom and left and right. Top bottom gives you low persistence and high persistence. On the right-hand side, from top left to top right, what you'll see there is the sigma. In other words, that is the standard deviation performance above the average. Folks, the trend lines there look similarly. And if you look moving from top to bottom, from low to high, the curves or the growth curves in terms of brand value does not really differ, doesn't really alter. What matters is how fast you grow and how quickly you grow above the average, which is the right-hand side of the graph. In other words, if you look at it, both lines are way above the left-hand side, and that's driven by the standard deviation performance above the average. So I think we can safely say that the one variable out of the Keller and Lehman model is that it's largely driven by your ability to outperform the market, and that persistence probably is not such a big deal, because we've seen the BRICS brands coming into top rankings with relatively low persistence scores. They've only been in the rankings 4 years, but they're actually doing much better than brands that's been in the rankings for 12 years. And that's simply the ability to build global brands from scratch that outperforms anybody else. If you look there, top right, 12.1, and bottom right, 12.4, that's Apple, 12.4. And some BRICS brands coming at 12.1. That explains the position of number 8 in the 2017 rankings. In other words, it can be done. There's a lot of good news for us in Russia, South Africa. All we need to do is get off our backsides and build powerful global brands, and things would come right. Folks, there's a minute. What's wrong with this research? The thing is, we only have 2 predictors of performance, region and persistence. What we need to do now is to integrate the classic VRIO variables from the resource-based theory, build that into our models, and try and explain the performance of brand performance based on a deeper analysis of resource-based theory variables. And we can also take the next level of RBT and include the dynamic capabilities issues as possible mediators. But there's a lot of work that we need to do in 2018, and that's, I guess, the purpose of this webinar. Could we start extending the ideas that we've got on this in South Africa, and maybe share some of the ideas with you in Russia, and maybe you've seen 1 or 2 ideas here, and we can get together and start sharing the cost, the burden, and the rewards of this kind of work. But final slide, and then I'm going to finish up. Why do we need to talk to Russia? Why do we need to talk to our friends around the world? Folks, we need papers. We need PhDs. We need to get smarter in terms of our methodological sophistication. And that we can only do by working together at a local and global level, get some collegial collaboration going, and build a research agenda with yourselves and business so that we can start competing, because this model shows that progressive, hard investment using resource-based theory into global brands pays off handsomely. And then the final motivator for you, possibly thinking of putting your research proposal together next 6 months or so, folks, this is great, because this is the differentiator of your MBA. You're the only person that can walk into the interview and say, this is what I've done. It's unique, no one else has done it. And that's what gets you the job. And I guess for us as business schools, we need to look at the growing importance of research, growing PhD programs, because really that's the ultimate differentiator of an MBA program. Otherwise, we just teachers, and there are a lot of those around. You got to be a researcher and a teacher. And on that note, I'll have a look here at the chat box if there's any questions. But I'll say, Dobreva Otra Moskwa. All the best and hope to see you soon. I'm wrapping up. Goodbye. And I'll stand around for a question or two. Well, I see a hello from City Business School. That's great. Hello from us here in the Eastern Cape. Hi, I'm here, Victor. I'm happy to ask or answer any final questions. I know it's 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock your side. Are there any questions, any ideas that you might want to share with us going forward? Happy to try and answer your questions. I'm looking at the chat box. Fire away. Professor Lester, are we going to call it a day?
I think so. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Well done. I couldn't make the chat wrong.
That's how I work this.
It was coming out loud and clear in my office.
Really?
Any differences that I need to see about it is that they will slide with blurry and then
You've got your settings. Go into settings. So it's 720 dpi. The Rhodes server, your Rhodes server will